outside law, studies, outside work, outside of anything that involves your professional trajectory, what do you actually value? Not what you think you should value. What do you actually, genuinely, in the quiet of your own life, value? What would you say to yourself that you valued when nobody else was watching? What makes you angry? What makes you feel alive? When do you lose time? When are you in a flow state? What kind of conversations energise you versus the kind of conversations that drain you? What are you like when no one is watching and there is nothing to prove? If those questions feel difficult, if they feel slippery, if the answers aren't coming easily, that's useful information. Not because difficulty means that there's something wrong with you, because there isn't, but because it might mean that for a significant period of your life or a large amount of your identity has been outsourced to your professional aspirations, and that's worth knowing. Hello and welcome back to The Diary of a Barrister. I'm your host, Chelsea Brooke-Ward. I'm an employment barrister at Park Square Barristers, and today I want to talk to you about something quite deep on a spiritual level, and it's who are you? Not in the arrogant sense, but are you pursuing a career because it's aligned with who you are, or are you pursuing a career because it's aligned with what you are told you are? Welcome back, or welcome if you're new here. Today we're going to be going somewhere that might make you a little bit uncomfortable, and I want that. I want you to sit with the discomfort, because I genuinely believe what we're going to talk about today could be one of the most important conversations you have this year, not the most intellectually impressive, not the one that gets you the most marks or the pupillage interviews, just one of the most important. And yes, I am blowing my own trumpet there. But here's the question I want you to put to you right now. Here's the question I want to put to you right now. Here's the question I want to put to you right now. Right at the top of this episode. Who are you? Not what do you want to be, not what your parents hope you'll be, not what your LinkedIn profile says, not what you told the admissions tutor at your law school interview when they asked, so why law, but who are you? And the follow-up, the one that actually keeps me up at night when I think about the people going through the legal education pipeline right now, does who you are align with what you're training to become? Because here's the thing, we live in a world, and particularly in a profession, that is absolutely extraordinary at getting people to do things for the wrong reasons. Law is exceptional at this. The legal profession has a gravity to it. It pulls people in, it sounds important, it is important. It comes with a certain kind of prestige, a certain identity, a certain kind of story you get to tell about yourself at dinner parties. And none of that is the same thing as it being right for you. And I've spoken to so many people over the years, students, junior barristers, trainee, newly qualified solicitors, who are somewhere between quietly miserable and actively burnt out. And when I ask them why they got into law in the first place, the answers are heartbreaking in their honesty. It seemed like obvious thing to do after a good degree. Everyone said I argued so. My parents were so proud when I got a training contract. I didn't really know what else to do when least law felt serious. Look, I'm not here to tell anyone those are wrong reasons to start. They might be completely fine reasons to start, but they are not reasons to continue. They are not reasons to build a life around, and they are definitely not the same as knowing. Really knowing who you are and whether this path genuinely fits that person. So today, for the next hour-ish, that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to talk about identity. We're going to talk about how the legal profession, more than almost any other, conflates who you are with what you do. We're going to talk about practical ways to actually figure out who you are, because, spoiler, most of us haven't been taught how to do this. And then we're going to ask the hard question, why does that version of you that exists beneath all that ambition and the fear and the expectation actually want to be a barrister, a solicitor, or a lawyer at all? And if the answer is yes, brilliant, that is clarity worth everything. And if the answer is uncertain or complicated or quietly no, then this might be one of those most useful hours you'll ever spend in your entire life. So let's get into it. I want to start by naming something that I think is so deeply embedded. In how we talk about people, especially in a professional context, that most of us don't even notice anymore, and that's the sad thing. We introduce ourselves by what we do. And think about it. You meet someone at a party, first question, what do you do? Not what do you care about? Not what makes you furious? Not what could you talk about for hours without stopping? Just what do you do? Like our professional role, our professional role or job title determines and dictates the person we are inside. And we answer it every time, without question. I'm a student. I'm studying law. I'm an employment barrister. I'm a trainee. And that answer lands like a complete sentence, like it tells the whole goddamn story, like it tells anything close to the whole story. But it doesn't, because I am not an employment barrister in my spare time. I'm not. I'm far from it. I am one of those individuals that breaks all stereotypical molds. And here's a concept that psychologists called enmeshment. It's a term that usually gets used in the context of family systems, describing relationships where two people's identities become so tangled up that they can't distinguish where one ends and where the other one begins. But I want to borrow the term and concept and apply it to the relationship between a person and their career, because what I see in the legal profession, and I see it constantly, is a kind of identity enmeshment between the individual and the vocation. The vocation says, I'm demanding, I'm prestigious, I require everything you have, I'm the kind of work that serious, intelligent people do. And if you're doing me, then you are serious and intelligent and important, and that's all you are. And the individual, often young, often uncertain, often absolutely desperate to prove themselves, says, yes, that's what I want to be, and that's who I am, and then that's how they act, and the merger happens. Quietly, without ceremony, and one day you're a person who is considering law, and then somewhere along the way you become a law person, and the difference between those two things is enormous. And it's important because if you are going through the interview stage, the recruiters and the panel want to know who you are, not what you do. And let me give you a bit more psychology here, because it genuinely helps to have a framework. Psychologist Erik Erikson, one of the greatest thinkers on human identity, described identity as something that develops across our lives through a series of crises, resolutions and commitments. The stage that most of you listening to this are probably in or have recently passed through is what he called identity versus role confusion. It's the stage where we're figuring out who we are as distinct from who other people need or want us to be. And here's what makes that stage especially treacherous when you're also navigating entry into a profession as demanding as law. The profession offers you a resolution. It says, don't worry about the identity crisis. Here's an identity. Take it, put it on. It fits people like you. And that is so seductive, because the alternative, sitting with the uncertainty of not knowing who you are, is genuinely uncomfortable. And law says you don't have to sit with that discomfort. Just pass the bar, get the pupillage, make your parents proud, and the identity crisis will sort itself out. Except it doesn't sort itself out. It gets buried, and buried things have a way eventually coming back up. And it manifests as imposter syndrome. It manifests as burnout. It manifests as depression. Now, and this is important, I want to be absolutely clear about something. Having a strong professional identity is not the problem. Loving law, genuinely loving law, finding it meaningful and energising and perfectly suited to who you are, that is wonderful. That is the dream. That is what we're aiming for in this conversation. The problem is when the professional identity is substituting for a self-understanding that never happened. When the gown goes on and suddenly the person underneath it doesn't matter anymore. When the achievement in the profession becomes the only metric by which you measure your worth as a human being. And look, the legal profession rewards that substitution. It actively incentivises it. The people who make silk, who become partners, who collect the cases and the accolades, they are often the people who have poured every part of themselves into the work. And there is a version of that which is beautiful, and there is a version of that which is a tragedy dressed up as success. But how do you tell the difference? And that's what we're going to get into, because it is really important that you don't spend your life pursuing a career that takes everything out of you to ultimately get to a place where you decide that was never right for me in the first place. But first, let me ask you something, and I want you to actually answer this, not in your head in a half-hearted, distracted way while you're also thinking about what you're having for dinner. Actually answer this. Outside law, studies, outside work, outside of anything that involves your professional trajectory, what do you actually value? Not what you think you should value, not the values you put in your personal statement, not the ones that sound good in a diversity statement. What do you actually, genuinely, in the quiet of your own life, value? What would you say to yourself that you valued when nobody else was watching? What makes you angry? What makes you feel alive? When do you lose time? When are you in a flow state? What kind of conversations energise you versus the kind of conversations that drain you? What are you like when no one is watching and there is nothing to prove? If those questions feel difficult, if they feel slippery, if the answers aren't coming easily, that's useful information. Not because difficulty means that there's something wrong with you, because there isn't, but because it might mean that for a significant period of your life or a large amount of your identity has been outsourced to your professional aspirations, and that's worth knowing. Here is what I want to say before we move on. This is not a niche problem. This is the experience of a few sensitive people who couldn't handle the rigour. Here's what I want to say before we move on. This is not a niche problem. This is not the experience of a few sensitive people who couldn't handle the rigour. This is structural. The selection process for law, the grades, the moots, the mini pupilages, the applications, the interviews, require you to perform a version of yourself for years before you ever actually do the job. And performance done long enough starts to feel like identity. You've been performing aspiring barrister for so long that you may have genuinely lost track of whether the person doing the performing actually wants the role, and most importantly, why if they do. So let's find out. I want you to spend some time specifically on law, because I think this profession, and the bar in particular, has some very specific characteristics that make the identity enmeshment problem worse than in most of the fields. And I think naming them clearly is one of the actual most compassionate things I can do for anyone going through this process. And the first one, the mythology. Law has a mythology around it that is almost unparalleled in professional life. Think about it. How law is depicted in film, in television, in literature, in the way it's talked about in schools and families. Brilliant barrister stand up in court, commanding the room, dismantling a witness with a single devastating question. The Casey who stays up all night preparing cross-examination, fueled by coffee and conviction. The Silk who takes the impossible case because justice demands it. That mythology is powerful, and some of it is even true. But here's the thing about myths. They don't tell you about the person behind the archetype. They tell you about the role. And when you're drawn to law at 18, 21, 24, however old you are, often what you're drawn to is the mythology, the story, the identity of the brilliant barrister. That is not the same as being drawn to the actual daily practice of law. The daily practice of law is, and I say this with deep respect, because I think it is genuinely meaningful work, it is also grinding, procedural, exhausting, relentlessly detailed orientated, and professionally isolating in ways that are hard to describe until you're in the middle of it. If the person you are loves detail, thrives on complexity, can sustain deep focus for long periods, has a genuine conviction about justice or advocacy or problem solving at the highest level, then the gap between mythology and the reality might not be that painful for you. You came in with a story, the story was incomplete, but the reality still fits who you are. But if the person you are is energised by collaboration, by creativity, by building things by human connection and rapid change, and the mythology of law was the only thing drawing you in, then hitting the reality of the profession is going to feel like a collision, a smack bang punch in the face. And the second characteristic is the cost. Not just financial cost, though that is real. The years of training, the BPC, the GLD, the law degree, the pupillage earnings that are not always what they seem, but the cost in time, in relationship, in alternative opportunity. You are choosing this path at an age when other doors are wide open. Every year you stay on this path past the point where it stops making sense is a year that another version of your life are quietly foreclosing. And that is important. That cost is not a reason to quit, of course not. At the first stage of or signs of hardship, law is hard, and that's certainly not what I'm saying. The beginning is particularly hard. Difficulty is not evidence of misalignment, but the cost does mean that the question of whether this path fits who you are is worth asking urgently and honestly, rather than deferring it until you're a decade in. I've seen so many people go through the pupillage application only to get 3-4 years in, or even sometimes not that far, to realise actually this is not a job that makes me happy, this is not a job that makes me feel alive, this is not what I thought it would be. And that time and those opportunities close and close and close as the time goes on. And the third characteristic, and this is the one that I want to spend the most time on, the culture of self-suppression. The legal profession, particularly the bar, has a culture that actively discourages self-expression of the kind I'm talking about today. Emotion is not generally welcomed in the professional space. Uncertainty is not celebrated. Talking openly about whether you're happy, whether this is right for you, whether you have doubts, that is not typically what happens over pupillage lunches or in chambers common rooms. There is work on this speaking point, on this topic, to be done and is being done at the bar, but generally speaking, there is a stoicism to legal culture, a sense that the work is the thing and your feelings about the work are largely irrelevant. Get on with it, keep your head down, do excellent work, don't complain. And again, there are things about the culture I understand and even appreciate. It produces rigour, it produces focus. There are elements of that toughness that the job genuinely requires. But that culture also produces barristers and solicitors who have been suppressing the question, is this actually for me, for 20 years, who look extraordinarily successful from the outside, the silk, the partner, the head of chambers, and who you are underneath, profoundly disconnected from themselves. I've had conversations with very senior people in law who have said quietly, when no one else was around, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know who I am outside of this. I haven't known for a long time. And that's heartbreaking. Not because there is anything wrong with, and that is genuinely heartbreaking, and not because there is anything wrong with dedication to your craft, but because dedication to craft that costs you your selfhood is not dedication. It's disappearance. There's also a fourth character I want to name briefly, the comparative culture. Law, especially the competitive end of it, the bar, the magic circle, the top sets, runs on comparison. Who got the better pupillage? Who got silk first? Who has the more impressive workload? Who's in the legal directories? And comparison is one of the most effective ways to keep yourself from ever asking whether you actually want the role you're competing for. Because when you're racing, you don't stop to ask if you've reached the finish line. You just run, and running is exhausting. And you can run for a very long time before you notice that you haven't asked yourself what the race is for. And I'm asking you now to stop running for the next hour. Just an hour. That's all I'm asking. Here's the question I want you to put to you now, and this is the serious one, so please actually sit with it. If law did not exist as a profession, if it simply was not an option, what would you be doing? And I don't mean what other respectable profession would you be in. I mean, what would you actually do? Or energy go? What problem would you spend your life on? What skills do you have that would find expression somewhere? Whatever came up just now, hold on to that because we're going to come back to it, okay? So let's get practical, because I know that for a lot of people listening, the more philosophical parts of this conversation are all well and good, but what actually is there to do? How do I do this? How do I actually figure out who the hell am I? And I love that question because it's answerable. It takes work, takes honesty, takes willingness to sit with some discomfort, but it is answerable. So let me give you some frameworks and exercises that I found genuinely useful. So, values excavation, not values selection. Here's the problem with most value exercises. They give you a list. Pick your top 5 values from the following: integrity, ambition, creativity, connection, and so on and so forth. And you pick the ones that sound like you, or the ones that you think should have, or the ones that, you feel professionally impressive. That's value selection, and it often produces a list that tells you very little about who you actually are. Values excavation is different. Instead of picking from a list, you work backwards from your own lived experience to uncover what you actually value. So think of 3 moments in your life when you felt most yourself. Not happiest necessarily, not most successful, but most yourself. Most genuinely alive, present and real. They might be academic, they might be completely outside of law, they might even be moments of pain or struggle. But once you've got the 3, once you've got them, good. Now, ask yourself, what was present in those moments? What was being expressed? What did the moments have in common? And then do the inverse. Think of 3 moments when you felt most unlike yourself. And that might be most performative, it might be most hollowed out, most like you were playing a role for somebody else's benefit, most burnt out, most unhappy. What was absent? What was being suppressed in those moments? The gap between those two lists, what was present in the moment of aliveness and absent in the moments of emptiness, that gap is your values. Not the words on a list, the actual lived reality of what you need to feel like to be yourself. And when I work through this exercise myself, I come back to it every year or so. The thing that come up consistently are autonomy, intellectual honesty, connection with people who are genuinely wrestling with hard ideas, and the sense that what I'm doing matters in a specific, not just theoretical way. And those things show up in my moments of aliveness. They are absent in my moments of emptiness. Your list will be different, but the exercise to find out is the same. And framework 2, the eulogy test. And why it works differently to how people think. And you've probably heard some version of the deathbed exercise. Imagine you're at the end of your life. What do you wish you'd done more of? It's a classic, but it's useful. But I want to use a variation that I find more powerful. Imagine your eulogy has been given, not by a family member who loves you unconditionally, but by a peer, someone who really knew you, a friend who would be honest. What do they say? Now, what would you want them to say? Not the idealised version. What do they actually say, given who you actually are right now on this trajectory? And then, what would you want them to say, not in vague terms, specifically, what 3 or 4 things would you hope they'd be able to truthfully say about who you were and how you lived? Now, here's a question. Is the person currently pursuing a legal career on track to become the person in that second eulogy, or is there a gap? And if there is a gap, what is it and why is it there? I find this exercise particularly useful for law students because it pulls you out of the immediate pressure of the career pipeline and into a much longer view. When you're staring at application deadlines and mini-pupillage reports and BPC assessments, everything feels urgent and close and enormous. The eulogy test gives you the altitude. It lets you see the shape of life rather than the texture of a particular Tuesday. It lets you see the bigger picture of actually where you do vision yourself in 10, 20, 30 years' time, which you might not be able to do with just the specific question, where do you want to be in 10 years' time? Because the focus and the narrative and the pressure sometimes blurs that vision. And framework 3, strength versus skill. Know the difference. This is one of the most underappreciated distinctions in thinking about vocation and identity. A skill is something you can do. You can be highly skilled at something and find it deeply draining. Many barristers are extraordinarily skilled at written advocacy, meticulous, precise, brilliant on paper, and find it exhausting in a way that feels corrosive rather than the good kind of tiring. A strength, in the way that Marcus Buckingham and the Strengths Finder research use the word, is an activity that makes you feel strong. Not physically, but energised, capable, like more of yourself. When you are in a strength, time moves differently. And I like to call this in a flow state. You've ever had one of those periods of time where you completely lost all track of time because you were doing something, you were so enthralled in something that time just flew past because you were enjoying it so much. And that means you can sustain it for longer periods before exhaustion sets in. And here's the question. When you're doing the actual work of law, reading cases, drafting, mooting or cross-examining, advising, do those activities make you feel stronger? Are you in a state of flow, or do you feel drained? Are they primarily things you are skilled at, or things you are both skilled at and energised by? Both is the goal. Both are rare, and I don't mean both the goal across the whole spectrum of skills required of a barrister or a lawyer, but you want to be in an area of law where those skills and flow states are the predominant factor rather than the minority. And if you find the work of law deeply energising, even when it's hard, that is significant, that is amazing, that matters. If you find the work exhausting in a way that depletes something fundamental, that also matters. And it's worth being honest about it. And that might just dictate whether you want to be a lawyer at all or what kind of law you want to do. Because if you can find an area of law where both your skill set and flow set are the predominant mechanism of how you work, then you're going to be more happy in the area that you've chosen. And the fourth framework, the mentor mirror. This one is simple and underused. Think of the lawyer, the barrister, legal professionals you most admire. Not the most not the most successful ones, the ones you most admire. The ones where you look at them and think, that person is living a life I could imagine being proud of. Now, ask, what are you admiring? Is it their legal brilliance specifically, their mastery of advocacy, their command of a courtroom, or is it something else? Their groundedness, their values, the way they treat people, the causes they've worked on, the cases they've worked on, the person they seem to be when they're not performing professionally. Because if what you're admiring is actually the person rather than the lawyer, if it's their humanity rather than their legal skill, then you might not need to be a barrister to be like them. Qualities you're drawn to might find expression elsewhere. And conversely, if what lights you up is the genuine legal work itself, the argument, the analysis, the courtroom, the brief, then you have something real to build on. I want to pause here and acknowledge some things. Some of you are listening to this in your second or third year of the LLB, or you might be going on to start the BPC. Some of you are partway through a training contract. Some of you might have a pupillage offer in hand, and you might be feeling a particular kind of dread right now. The dread of, what if this exercise tells me something I cannot act on? And I hear that. That's a real concern. But here's what I want to say. Knowing who you are is never, ever a problem. Even if the timing is complicated, even if you can't change your immediate situation, clarity about yourself, what you value, what energises you, what kind of life you want to build is never, ever a liability. And often what people find when they do this work is not that they need to abandon law entirely, it's that they need to do law differently. There are many, many ways to practice. There are many types of chambers. There are many types of clients. There are many areas of law. Some of them will fit you far better than others. Knowing who you are helps you aim. It helps you have that vision and that alignment. All right, you've done the work, or at least you've started it. I hope. You've thought about values, your strengths, what energises you, what flow state, what doesn't, who you admire and why. Now the big question, does who you are actually align with a career in law, and if so, which? And let me offer you another framework for thinking about this, because I want to get away from the binary of law is right for me versus law is wrong for me. Reality is almost never that clear cut. This is the person for whom law is genuinely, authentically right. Strong alignment. Not because it's prestigious, not because they're good at it, but because the actual practice of law, the arguments, the briefs, the advocacy, the problem solving, the rigour, the service to clients maps closely onto what this person values and what makes them feel alive. And these people exist. I'm one of them. They're not rare, and they often have a quality about them that is hard to fake. They are curious about law outside of work. They read cases for interest. They follow legal developments, not because they have to, but because they genuinely want to. Law is not just what they do. It is in some meaningful sense how they see the world. And if this is you, and you know it genuinely rather than aspirationally, then the work of this episode, excuse me, is not should I do law? It's how do I make sure I do law in a way that honours who I actually am, rather than disappearing into the role? Partial alignment. And this is probably most common category and the most nuanced. This is the person who has genuine talents and even genuine interest in some aspects of law, but for whom other aspects of the profession are at a significant cost. They love the intellectual work but find the professional culture alienating, for example. They are passionate about justice but find the commercial side deadening. They are great advocate but terrible with administrative and procedural grind. For this person, the question is not should I be a lawyer, but what kind of lawyer should I be? How do I build a career that leans into the alignment and honestly manage the misalignment within who I am? And this requires self-knowledge. It requires being honest about what you will and won't sustain over decades. And it requires not just getting into the law, but making active choices about the shape of the career within it. And category 3, fundamental misalignment. This is the person who, when they are truly honest with themselves, when they strip away the expectation and the sunk cost and the fear, does not actually want to be a barrister or a lawyer, who is pursuing it for reasons that are real, but that are not, this is who I am and this is the work I am meant to do. It's usually because they are pursuing it because of expectations externally. If this is you, I want you to say something important. You are not a failure, you are not weak, you are not wasting your education or your potential or your parents' hopes. You are a person who is doing the courageous and genuinely difficult work of figuring out who you are rather than just doing what you were pointed at and told to do. And the earlier you face it, the better. Not because leaving is easy, it isn't. It is probably one of the most difficult decisions that anybody would ever have to make after going through and investing all that time. But because the longer you stay in a fundamentally misaligned path, the more it costs you. In time, in energy, and in the ability to be able to say, this is not for me. In your 30s, in your 40s, in the slow erosion of energy and joy and selfhood that comes from spending the majority of your waking hours doing work that is not yours, that does not make you happy. The world is full of brilliant people doing work that is not theirs. Law is full of them. And most of them knew, earlier than they'd like to admit, that something just wasn't quite right. Knowing is better than not knowing, always. I want to close this section with something that is genuinely important. Alignment is not a permanent state. It is not a test you pass once and then you're done. Who you are changes, law changes, the kind of work you're drawn to at 23 is not necessarily what you will sustain at 45. This is not a one-time exercise. The question, who am I and does my professional life align with that, is a question worth revisiting throughout your career. The best lawyers I know, the ones who seem genuinely well in themselves as well as professionally accomplished, are people who never stop asking this. I want to spend the last few minutes here being very direct about why this matters, because I think there is a temptation, especially in a profession that values stoicism and toughness, to hear everything we've talked about today and think, interesting, a bit navel-gazing, but ultimately the work is the work, get on with it. I want to respectfully and energetically push back on that. The stakes of getting this wrong are not small. Let's start with the obvious one, mental health. The legal profession has among the highest rates of depression, anxiety and burnout of any profession. That is not a coincidence. That is simply because law is hard work. Lots of professions involve hard work. It is, in part, a consequence of a culture that has systematically encouraged people to suppress their inner lives in service of professional performance, to be excellent lawyers while not particularly attending to whether being a lawyer is excellent for them. When who you are and what you spend your life doing are chronically misaligned, the psychological cost is real. It doesn't always look like collapse. It often looks like low-grade dissatisfaction. Cynicism that creeps in slowly. A difficulty remembering why you cared about any of this in the first place. A Sunday evening dread that you've normalised because everyone around you seems to have normalised it too. You deserve better than that, and more practically, your clients deserve better than that. The best legal work comes from the people who are genuinely engaged, not people who are performing engagement while their inner life quietly withers. The second stake, contribution. Here's something I believe very strongly. The world is not well served by brilliant people doing the wrong work. If you are someone whose deepest strengths are creative problem solving, in community building, in teaching, in policy, in entrepreneurship, and you spend 30 years producing excellent legal brief, the world gets decent legal briefs and loses something it needs more. This is not melodrama. This is resource allocation. Your gifts are specific. The context in which they flourish are also specific. The overlap between your gifts and the demands of legal practice might be large or small. Figuring it out, its actual size, is one of the most important pieces of work you can do. Not just for yourself, but for the people who will be shaped by whatever you contribute to the world. And the third stake is the long game. Law is a long game. A career at the bar typically spans 40 years or more. 40 years is a long time to be doing something that is wrong for you. It is also a long time to build something that is genuinely yours, if you know what that thing is. The people I find most compelling in law, the ones who seem to have built something real and sustainable, are almost invariably people who know themselves, know why they do this work, know what it costs them and what it gives them. They are not performing in a role they fell into. They are living a vocation that they chose. This is what I want for you, not just a career in law, not just a professional success, a vocation you choose consciously, honestly, and in full knowledge of who you are. So let me close with this. The question, who are you, is not a distraction from your professional development. It is the foundation of it. Every piece of professional advice about how to develop your practice, how to build a reputation, how to survive in the early years, how to build a career you're proud of, every single piece of it lands differently depending on who you are. I know you, if you know who you are, if you've outsourced your identity, if you don't know who you are, if you've outsourced your identity to the profession, to your grades, to the opinions of gatekeepers and chambers rankings and chambers pupillage committees, then you are not building a career, you are being carried by one. And being carried is fine until the river changes direction. So here's what I want you to do, just one thing, one actionable thing before you put this episode away. Write down your answer to the question, not in your head, on paper, in a document, somewhere physical that you can come back to. Who am I outside law? What do I value? What makes me feel alive? And does the path I'm on give adequate space to be that person? You don't have to answer it perfectly. You don't have to have it all figured out, but you just need to start. Just write something real. Because the examined life is not a luxury. In a profession as demanding and identity consuming as law, it is a necessity. You are not your vocation. You are a person with a specific character and specific values and specific gifts. The work, whatever it is, should be in service of that person, not the other way around. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you next time. If you've liked this episode, please like, subscribe, leave a comment and share it with somebody who genuinely needs to hear it. Until next time, take care. Bye.